5, 6, 7, 8. And I learned from my Jewish classmates how important it was to take a stand.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City. On the internet at thestruggle.org. Our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. Al-Qaeda in Yarmouk Camp allowed its so-called enemy, ISIS, into the camp to kill Palestinians. ISIS has now taken over most of the area, though Palestinians are still fighting back. It once housed 180,000 Palestinians and Syrians. There was a protest walk in New York City. We cover that at the start of our program, including a remark I made about Syrian regime atrocities. We also have more on the show from Lia Tarachansky in her New Haven visit, and a portion of a speech given to Jewish Voice for Peace by Angela Davis. We begin walking to the Syrian and Israeli embassies in New York City on the way to the United Nations.
5, 6, 7, 8.
What I was saying is this: as we march for Yarmouk, we remember all the Palestinian refugees. Without them, there wouldn't be a Palestinian cause. And for all the conversations y'all have with people that say international law, United Nations 194 resolution, it doesn't matter. That's a human right. People continuously are displaced and dispossessed in Palestine and in Syria and in Gaza, 2 and 3 times fold. So when we're fighting for them, that's the deepest form of solidarity.
I am from Israel. I am Jewish. I am a member of Jewish Voice for Peace because we want justice. We want freedom for people. And the most vulnerable people are the Palestinian people. And I know that because I've been there. And what I am saying is what I was an eyewitness. And what you see, you cannot unsee anymore. And what you know, you cannot unknow anymore. So I saw and I knew. And we want freedom for the Palestinians. This is what we want.
We're over here by the United Nations. 2 weeks ago, they had an exhibit about Syria. They got photographs of a man they called Caesar. He was a Syrian military photographer. And he said he came out of Syria with 50,000 photos of corpses and tortured people. Now, I interviewed Yasser Munaf, Syrian from Emerson College, and I said, wait a second, why would the Syrian government want to document atrocities and war crimes that they could be held responsible for? And the answer was very mundane, very understandable. He said, well, they were arresting these people and relatives would come and say, here's a couple $100, let my brother, let my uncle go. And they were doing it. And so Assad and his people, we want proof. We don't want the guards to be doing this anymore. We want to see corpses. And they had this stuff photographed. And so Munaf is confirmed or sure that these are authentic photos. And the UN, I think, put 18 or 20 of these photos there. And there's a very interesting story in the Guardian, or not a story, but pictures, not of the horror things, but of people looking at these pictures and in shock and disgust and with tears in their eyes for these horrible things. that went on in Syria to all kinds of Syrians and anyone who did resistance.
Talal, you're holding a sign that says Hassan Hassan, martyr of the revolution. What can you say about this person?
Well, this particular individual was very well known within Yarmouk. He was very active, he was a poet, he was an actor, and he was a very well-known activist within the camp. What happened was he tried to escape in 2012, and during that period he was arrested by the Syrian regime. Afterwards, it was discovered by way of the Syrian authority letting his parents know that he was dead. Now, what happened with him and with over 350 cases of Palestinians was that he was tortured to death in the regime. An interesting aspect of this, a gruesome and interesting aspect of this, that one of the pictures, the Caesar pictures that was released, turned out to be him, and it was identified by his friends and family.
You mentioned the Caesar pictures. What are they?
Well, the Caesar pictures are thousands of pictures that were released by someone who left Syria and had taken pictures of all of these bodies of both Syrians and Palestinians that had been tortured to death. And they were recently displayed at the UN here. And so it allowed for a kind of verification that we didn't have before. A lot of people impugned our accounts when we were putting out the names and saying we verified this with their families. We have the death certificate that the Syrian authorities gave their families. A lot of people continue to cast doubt on these accounts. Now with the pictures, over 40 Palestinians have been identified within the pictures. We know that within these prisons that one of the easiest ways to go, and it's terribly gruesome, but this is one of the best ways to go, is people get body sores. And so in their final moments, in a delirious, feverish haze, you find that they'll be sitting and the meat from their bones will just fall off. That's just one of the many ways that people die in Assad prisons.
Now, let me ask a kind of broader question. Sometimes you hear from people who support Palestinians normally, they say, well, we shouldn't say anything about Assad and the government because they're under the gun of the U.S. imperialism, and, you have to put that aside, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's absurd. I mean, this notion that we dictate to other people who are engaged in popular uprisings, regardless of whatever proxy elements get involved, that we have the authority to tell them, well, you can't stand up against this person just because they aren't in the good grace of the U.S. is absurd, and it's hugely offensive. If your concern about Syrians is minimum, then you should take the fact that over 2,500 Palestinians have been killed by Bashar al-Assad. This alone, I think, makes it very clear that standing with Bashar al-Assad, or even being silent or neutral about it, is unacceptable. And as a Palestinian, I reject this notion, and I know that most Palestinians within Yarmouk also reject this notion, even those who speak out, as I do, against some of the crimes of the opposition.
By the way, how did ISIS get through the siege of Assad's forces all around Yarmouk Camp? Nobody reports that they got in through a battle. Assad let them in for his own wretched purposes. We featured Lia Tarachansky on the program last week after she had her film On the Side of the Road shown at Yale University. Here's more of the Q&A in the New Haven Library the next day. One question she was asked was why she was so negative about Israel and why she didn't tell more about Jews and Palestinians working together.
I find it very funny that you say that because I'm a journalist. It's not my job to go around videotaping some joint experiences. And by the way, these joint experiences are very, very few. Mixed marriages between Jewish and Muslim people in Israel, out of all of the mixed marriages in the country, Jewish and Muslim marriages are 1,000 marriages. So the actual number of mixed marriages, the actual living together experiments are so few and far in between that it would be propaganda to show them. And of course, I don't think that is the job of an American journalist to go and document how wonderful America is. The journalist is always from a position of critique, and this is why I do the work that I do. But having said all of that, in the film, as you saw yesterday, there's all kinds of scenes that, in my opinion, demonstrate my love for my country. And the reason for why I do what I do is because I want my children to grow up in that society, but in a democratic way. I don't want my children to learn that the rest of the Palestinians need to be expelled, which is what, by and large, we learn in Israeli schools, is that the Palestinians are the source of the problem, and if they were not here, there would be no problem. So the reason I do for what I do is because I want my society to evolve into something better. Now, I don't say Israel is Nazifying, or however you put it. I think that the parallels are very different, are not strong. For example, in the Second World War, 50 million people were butchered by the Nazi imperial war, plus 6 million Jews and Roma and homosexuals and communists and people with mental and physical handicaps. They were butchered by the will of one nation that saw itself as supremacist. The intention of the German people, or the German, let's say, National Socialist Project, was to enslave everyone to the east of Germany, to exterminate the Jewish people, and to dominate the world. Everything, first of all, the Nazi regime led to the demolition of 70,000 villages. I mean, there's no comparison in basic numbers between what happened in those years in Israel. Secondly, the intention is very different. The intention of the Israeli Jews was never to exterminate Palestinians. The intention is to have maximum land with minimum non-Jews, which in fact is the now reincarnation of the Zionist narrative, the Zionist nationalist project. This is what it is referred to today. So, for example, the former Minister of Interior, who sees himself as an ardent Zionist and as an ardent spokesperson for Zionism, when he was speaking in the parliament, what I noticed in his language is he was always talking about who is the new non-Jew that we need to expel. Why? Because Zionism means Jews and Jews only in the Holy Land. So he is personally responsible for the fact that almost all of the African refugees in Israel, which were a tiny, tiny population of people, in comparison, the city of London has 5 times the number of refugees that the entire country of Israel had at the peak of the African refugees. And what he led to is the mass expulsion and the deportation of most of the African refugees, the death of more than 800 people as a result of these deportations, particularly to South Africa, and the imprisonment of thousands of people. And when he was asked about this, when he was asked why is he, for example, he created a police unit that would go to any person of color and ask for their ID, and if they were a refugee, if their visa expired, they would be sent to a prison in the middle of the desert. Now, this way, they managed to get rid of the majority of the African refugee population out of Israeli cities. Now, when you ask refugees, why is your visa expired? They would say, I stood in line for hours trying to get it renewed, but the Ministry of Interior cut down the number of hours that you can get your visa renewed from working Monday to Friday, let's say, to working 2 hours twice a week. So for a population that was now, thanks to this minister, forced to renew its visa every single month, standing in line at the beginning of every single month to get their visa renewed became impossible, because you're standing in line for 6 hours. They can only accept 200 people at a time. No matter what you do, you end up with an expired visa, which means you end up in a giant prison in the middle of the desert in an area that Israel calls a military firing zone, where you are basically constantly surrounded by military drills. And during this war, you're also getting rocketed with rockets from Gaza. So this is the attitude towards people that have fled to Israel because of the Libyan war in 2011, because the situation became very bad in Egypt, out of necessity. They didn't have anywhere else to go. They couldn't turn back to Sudan. They couldn't go west to Libya. They could not stay in Egypt, so they started coming to Israel. And in Israel, they find themselves criminalized, forbidden to work, either deported or sent into a giant prison in the desert. Now, by any measure of any kind of developed nation's attitude towards refugees, this is extreme brutality. There isn't a single other nation that is a developed economy that treats refugees that way. And the Minister of Interior personally took responsibility for this policy. And when he was constantly asked by people who, let's say, are more humanitarian, why he is treating the African refugees that way. The answer was always Zionism. They are not Jews. Don't you get it? This is the country of the Jews. Being the country of the Jews means a country for the Jews and only Jews. And anyone who is not Jewish is not welcome. And in fact, in one of his most famous press conferences, he said the job of the Ministry of the Interior is to make these refugees' lives so miserable that they will leave of their own accord. Now, in general, you can say, well, that's so racist, because, of course, these people are Africans. And the bottom line of it is not so much racism about them as human beings being black. It's racism because they are not Jewish. So it comes from the perspective of what the Israeli establishment today sees what is Zionism. What is its mission? So as a journalist, it's not my job to then go and show the 5 or 10 examples where, there's living together. In my journalism, I would have to say I did go out of my way to document Israelis who do humanitarian work and human rights work, and who fed these refugees when they were basically left with no shelter and no food, who went all the way to the middle of the desert to these prisons to deliver them food. I've gone out of my way to show the better parts, but I cannot show this policy as something positive. So as a journalist, my job is to critique the worst part of the society. Anything else would be propaganda.
She was asked about the Israeli peace camp.
Well, I think that as a civilian population, the Israeli public is actually quite liberal. So there's, for example, Israel is very, let's say, gay-friendly. It's very green. The society is very, in the common knowledge of liberal, quite liberal. But when it comes to security, to the war on terrorism, the so-called war on terrorism, and anything that has to do with, let's say, external relations, it's an extremely conservative country. And it's not by accident. I mean, Netanyahu was one of the first people to coin the term the war on terrorism already in the 90s, when in his book, already back then, he was saying that it's only going to take a massive attack on the United States to get America to realize that this is a clash of civilization that it has to be involved in and go and attack the Muslim world. And this is the rhetoric that is winning, because, I mean, essentially there was a peace movement in Israel that was huge in the 80s, in 1982. And so many soldiers were dying in the 1982 war on Lebanon that you had the biggest protest movements in the country's history. We had at some point more than 200,000 people on the streets protesting the war. Now, it was coming from a place of not wanting to send our boys to the war. But okay, anyway, it was against the war. That peace movement continued to grow until the 90s, where after the first Palestinian unarmed uprising, there was the Oslo Accords, the so-called peace accords. And this began what is known as the peace process. The peace process, while there was, all these negotiations in Washington and so on about how there would be 2 states created and so on, the number of settlements, Israeli colonies in the West Bank, doubled and then tripled. And so when the Palestinians were looking around at the territory that they're supposed to be getting in this future state that they're negotiating over, they're seeing the number of Israeli colonies doubling and tripling, and their land confiscated more and more and more. And so, of course, their patience ran out, and the second uprising started, this one armed, using all kinds of tactics, including suicide bombings and attacks on military and civilian targets. And this movement collapsed the Israeli peace community, because the Israeli public was looking at the peace community and saying, these are the people you want us to make peace with? They're going up and blowing up buses. What are you talking about? And the entire idea of peace became marginalized and became a cliche of itself and collapsed. In fact, the entire Israeli peace camp collapsed in about 1 week in October. And if you want to know more about that, we did a 12-part series called What Happened to the Israeli Peace Camp with a man called Michel Varshavsky. He's wonderful. So you can go on therealnews.com and you'll find that series there. Sure. But I just want to say one last thing. Since that collapse of the so-called peace camp, which I call it so-called because it was unrealistic. It was talking about things that had no bearing to what was happening on the ground. And when it was presented with some very bare facts, it collapsed. Since then, we've seen a rise of an actual peace movement that is doing everything in its power to stop this project. a peace movement that of lawyers, of people who are with their own hands rebuilding houses that were demolished by the Israeli bulldozers, that are journalists, people who are practically working on the ground so that we can live together despite what the government is doing. And I think that this movement is actually growing. And for me, they are a very big inspiration.
I asked her about the Mizrahi Jews in Israel. You may recall on a program several months ago, we had a Mizrahi named Smadar Levi, who said that the Jews who had come from Arab and Southeast European countries to Israel were treated very badly by the Jews there from the ruling Ashkenazi group.
When it comes to the treatment of the Mizrahi Jews in Israel, we talked about this yesterday, so I don't want to elaborate on it too much. But by and large, they were used to settle the most dangerous, the least fertile, and the most unwelcoming terrain in Israel. So they were put in the north and in the south, in what is known in Israel as the periphery. So basically, what we call in America the projects. Basically, building communities with no investment, no resources, no industrial towns, no real municipal, they don't have the nice lawns and the big libraries and the great universities. These are the places where you can barely get a job at McDonald's. So I don't know if I would call it apartheid. I think we throw around a lot of words. Apartheid is an internationally defined crime under international law. I mean, if we are actually going to make such comparisons, we need to be looking at the definition of apartheid and seeing whether it applies. And I didn't do that work, and I'm not going to be throwing out words without having done my research. But I will say that the treatment of the Mizrahim is without a doubt discrimination. And to this day, there's a lot of mythology in Israel that the racism, and of course in Israel when you say the racism, usually it means against other Jewish people. So against the Ethiopian Jews or the Mizrahi Jews. Many Israeli whites believe that the racism is over. But if you talk to Israeli Mizrahi Jews, I mean, it sounds ridiculous. What do you mean it's over? So, for example, we've never had a prime minister who is Mizrahi Jewish, right? We never had anyone in the high levels of power to really take care of this community. There has never been an equal distribution of municipal funding. The average Israeli Ashkenazi white Jew makes between 20% and 40% more than their Mizrahi colleagues. The access of Mizrahi Jews to positions of power is so limited, and the very few that make it tend to appease the environment in which they're in. I think that in essence, the problem here is that this hierarchy of rights is legitimized. Once we start talking not so much about what does it mean to have a Jewish state, but what does it mean to have a democratic state, we're going to have to, at the very least, write a constitution. Because every country that calls itself democratic has a constitution or something like a constitution, and the very first sentence of that constitution is every citizen of this state will be equal, based on religion and sex and race and so on. Israel doesn't have a constitution. It doesn't have anything, except for maybe you can say the Declaration of Independence, which doesn't hold any legal right, that says all the citizens will be equal. And in fact, the citizens legally are not equal. There is a legal distinction between Jewish and non-Jewish citizens, and there's a practical discrimination between people, depending more or less on their background. So when we start talking about democracy, we can talk about actually equalizing it and delegitimizing this rhetoric of striated rights. Does that answer your question?
To conclude our coverage of the Jewish Voice for Peace national meeting in Baltimore, we have some of the remarks of scholar, activist, and former political prisoner Angela Davis. She herself had gone to the foremost secular Jewish college in the country, Brandeis University.
Because I know that the organization has grown exponentially over the last year. And that this growth is indicative of an important shift in popular political consciousness that is in part a function of the organizing work that has been going on over the last period. And let me say that I'm really happy that there is a student chapter at Brandeis. I often point out that when I was an undergraduate at Brandeis, and I'm not going to even tell you how long ago that was, that was when I first became active in Palestine solidarity. When oftentimes when people mistakenly try to argue that it is anti-Semitic to stand up against the state of Israel, I'll say, I learned how to do this at a university that was founded in the same year as the state of Israel. And I learned from my Jewish classmates how important it was to take a stand. People are recognizing that they have stood on the sidelines of the issue of Palestine and Israel for too long. The attack this summer on Gaza demonstrated that as long as we stand on the sidelines, that means the possibility that the state of Israel may become even more aggressive. It was previously the case that people assumed that if this is a question of a conflict, Israel-Palestine conflict, then one has to take one side or the other. In other words, one could not take the side of justice. One could not take the side of the Jewish people inside Israel who stand up as ethically and as fervently as people here in the U.S. stand up against the U.S. government. Even a government headed by the first black president, a government that continues to insist on destroying the lives of people in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. If we can oppose the policies and practices of the U.S. government, then certainly we can oppose the policies and practices of the state of Israel. And we can stand up against the U.S. government for being the major financial and ideological supporter of the occupation of Palestine. Long ago that it was the case that people could claim to be progressive. And I heard Rebecca talking about Pep in Puerto Rico. So progressive except Palestine. But it was also the case that many progressive, so-called progressive organizations refused to take a position. Thus, Palestine was not incorporated into their social justice agendas, which made it so much easier to be progressive except Palestine. It also used to be the case that people could be intimidated to keep quiet on the question of Palestine, because in order to be a legitimate spokesperson for justice in Palestine, you had to be aware of all of the political and economic dimensions of the conflict. If you could not speak as an expert, if you could not speak with the kind of authority that CNN demands, that is, if you had not spent years studying the situation in Israel, Palestine, you did not have the right to speak. But movements for justice are never movements of experts only. And as a matter of fact, we can all be experts on justice by virtue of our identification with global movements for peace, equality, and justice. All of which is to say that we need ever larger numbers of people willing to speak out for justice. After years of being marginalized now, Students for Justice for Palestine on campuses all over the country are experiencing a really important cycle of growth. And that is an indication that everyone is to be urged to speak out. And Jewish Voice for Peace can play a pivotal role during this current period. You can not only help to further broaden the campaign for BDS. Palestine is our South Africa. But you can help to give leadership to movements against racism here in the US. Jewish activists who stand up for justice in Palestine are particularly well positioned to model what it means to stand up against racism. And for white people to stand up against racism, and of course I'm not assuming that all Jews are white or that white is a stable identitarian category. Still, white people have to be willing to give leadership. And let me say that, I know that the whole notion of allies is important, but I'm sometimes disturbed by the bifurcation of the real activists and then the allies. I think that that can sometimes serve as a pretext for not giving leadership. And white activists have to be willing to give leadership, as they have to be willing to accept leadership from people of color. This is a very exciting moment. I don't think that there has ever been, at least in my lifetime, there's never been such a growing consciousness of the intersectionality of our struggles. And I use this feminist term to acknowledge the strong impact of feminism on radical movements today. At a time when global capitalism has led to corporate alliances like G4S, which you all know is the largest security corporation in the world, and it links the prison-industrial complex with war, with gender violence. At a time when this is happening within the hierarchies of global capitalism, we are compelled to speak back with the voices of our global solidarities. And one of the most important of these voices is Jewish Voice for Peace. Carry on, and thank you.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.